to the Sci-Fi Fridays podcast. Here, you'll be listening to original science fiction stories infused with truth. I'm your host, Allie Anderson, and I'll be reading stories that I have written myself. Episodes are released every Friday. Today's episode is called Town of Geniuses. As Bryan and his older brother Edward were on their way home from school, he saw Mr. Morris driving his buggy wildly down the main dirt road. Grant smiled and waved at Mr. Morris, but Mr. Morris didn't return the greeting. "Was that Mr. Morris?" Edward asked. Grant nodded. Mr. Morris was the man who brought supplies into their town Stiffvale that the farmers there couldn't produce themselves. "I think so," Grant said. "He was going at a rather dangerous speed, wasn't he?" "He sure was." Edward kicked the dirt with his boots. Without asking, Grant knew that Edward was now calculating the exact speed that Mr. Morris had been going. That was what made Edward special. Everyone in their small hometown had something that made them special. It was what made their town interesting and kept things exciting despite being so isolated. "Father said he wanted us to pick up the mail on the way home," Edward said. Grant nodded. Together they began walking down the path that took them to the post office. "Where do you think Mr. Morris was rushing off to?" Edward was silent for a moment before he answered. "At that speed, it would have taken him exactly 7.83 minutes to the Whitners' farm, and he would have made it to the infirmary in exactly 3.5 minutes. Grant paused. "Do you think he had an injury?" Edward shrugged. "If he was driving that fast, he might have, or someone else might have." As they turned the bend in the road, Grant saw Mr. Morris's buggy parked in front of the post office. Mr. Morris was talking to Mr. Parsons, the post office manager, beside it. They were having their own conversation, so Grant and Edward quietly stood behind them and waited so as not to be rude and interrupt. "It really is a wonder," Mr. Morris was saying. Mr. Parsons nodded. "Yes, I can't believe they've lived here so long and not known anything." Both men had their backs to Edward and Grant, so they didn't know that the boys could hear them. Grant knew it was wrong to eavesdrop, but he was curious about what they were saying. He looked at Edward, who seemed equally enthralled in Mr. Morris's and Mr. Parsons' conversation. "Do you think any of them will find out about the outside world? After all, no one else in the whole world lives like they do." Mr. Parsons shoved his hands in his pockets. Mr. Morris shook his head. He laughed abruptly, making Grant jump. "As long as we give them their necessities and make them believe like the rest of the world really is like their own town, they have no reason to even want to leave this place. I'd even like to live here in Stiffvale myself." That was strange. Grant had always thought that Mr. Morris lived in Stiffvale. If he truly didn't live here, where did he live? "Why's that?" Mr. Parsons asked. Mr. Morris swept his arms toward the road and the buggy parked in front of the post office. "Life here is simple. There's no technology to break down, no cars to make road noises on the highway." Grant tried to make sense of what Mr. Morris was saying. Technology? What was that? And cars? These terms were exotic, yet sort of familiar. They almost felt like they created an itch at the back of Grant's mind that he couldn't scratch. Something that was there, but he somehow couldn't get to it. He looked over at Edward, who also appeared confused. Edward raised his eyebrows at Grant, then shrugged as if silently telling Grant he didn't know what was going on either. "Well, I guess I better head back to headquarters. I just thought I'd give you the update, Carl." Mr. Morris clapped Mr. Parsons on the shoulder. Mr. Parsons sighed. "Thanks. Have a nice trip back into town." Edward and Grant exchanged a look. Mr. Morris and Mr. Parsons were about to discover that Edward and Grant had been listening to their conversation. Their parents would be so disappointed in them. Grant was ashamed just thinking about it. There was nothing for them to do except face the consequences. Grant held his breath as Mr. Morris turned around. His expression went from surprise to guilty when he spotted Grant and Edward. "Good afternoon, boys. Had a good day at school, I hope?" "Yes, sir," Edward said beside Grant. Grant nodded. Mr. Morris smiled, seeming to relax a bit. "Good. I'd better get going. I'll see you two around." Again, Grant nodded. Maybe Mr. Parsons and Mr. Morris didn't know that Edward and Grant had been listening to their conversation. He looked over at Mr. Parsons, who smiled warmly at them. "Your father told me that you'd pick up some mail today," Mr. Parsons said. "Come in. I have a package for you to take home." Together, Grant and Edward got the mail from Mr. Parsons, then headed down the path that led to their family's farm. "What do you think they were talking about back there?" Grant said, finally breaking the silence that had fallen between them. Edward sighed. "I have no idea. It sounded like something we weren't supposed to hear." Grant shifted the package so that it was underneath his arm. "What do you think Mr. Morris was talking about?" Edward shoved his hands in his pockets. "It sounds like something about the citizens of Stiffvale. Remember he talked about how he wanted to live here himself?" "I thought he does live here," Grant said. "That's what he's led everyone to think." As they turned the last bend in the road to their house, something occurred to Grant. "What does it look like in the other towns?" Edward turned his face toward Grant. "What do you mean?" Grant raised his eyebrows. "Have you ever left Stiffvale? I haven't. I'm pretty sure our parents haven't either. Mr. Morris is the only one I know of in town who goes outside of Stiffvale on a regular basis." Edward stopped walking. "You're right. He made it sound like the towns outside of Stiffvale are much different, didn't he?" Grant stopped alongside Edward, nodding. "Yeah." He looked back at the road that they had been walking on. "Isn't there supposed to be a town nearby? Scandium's the name. What do you think we'd find if we went to Scandium?" Edward shrugged. "I have no idea." Grant glanced around at their surroundings. Besides the dirt road was their father's land that hadn't been tended to yet this season. There was no one around to watch them. Grant had to find out for himself. He could probably go to Scandium and back and be home before bedtime. He glanced at Edward. If Grant told him about what he was planning, Edward might not let him go. And if he did, their parents would be upset at Edward for letting him go. Grant stopped walking. "Edward, I forgot something back at the post office." He hated lying, but he couldn't think of any other excuse. "You keep going and I'll catch up later." Edward raised an eyebrow at Grant, but nodded. "Okay, be fast." Grant nodded. "I will." With that, he turned around and hurried on his way to find answers. After the first hour or so, Grant began getting tired of seeing the endless fields of greenery and whatever plants and vegetables the farmers in this area were growing. With a sinking feeling in his stomach, Grant realized that it was his turn to help his father out in the field today. Maybe he should go back. What would he do if he got to Scandium and discovered that it was just like Stiffvale? He'd hate to have wasted so much time and make his parents worry just because of that. If he turned back now, he wouldn't have known that at all. Would it be better to never know than to know that he'd made the trip for nothing? He could go back now and be home by supper time. Then Grant remembered something his father always said. "Perseverance is always better than giving up." Grant guessed that even though he was going far behind his family's back to do this, it would be even worse to go back and tell them he worried them for nothing. It was too late to go back and deny the fact that he was being sneaky about going to Scandium, so he might as well keep going. He knew he'd have to face the consequences later, though. Just when he thought he couldn't stand seeing another endless row upon endless row of vegetables, he saw it. Scandium. This was it. Grant couldn't believe his eyes. There were buildings much taller than he'd ever seen before. They had to have several levels on top of each other. Grant wondered how many people could live in those kinds of buildings. A strange noise was coming from Scandium, too. It made that itch at the back of Grant's mind return. It was a slow, rumbling sound. Then he heard another sound. It sounded like the geese when they flew overhead, except it was louder and sounded almost artificial. Finally, as he drew closer, he saw what it was. It was a smooth, dark gray road with giant metal objects going fast past it. Grant stopped a moment to watch them. The closer he got to them, the more that itch at the back of his mind grew. What did these strange things remind him of? They seemed familiar. But Grant hadn't seen anything like them before. Hadn't he? They reminded him somewhat of a wagon, but there was no horse to pull them. Strange. So Mr. Morris was right. The world really was different outside of Stiffvale. He had been keeping this secret to everyone in Stiffvale. Grant knew he could turn back around with this new knowledge and be home before sunset, but there was something that made him want to go deeper, something that made him want to see what Scandium was all about. Carefully avoiding the swift metal objects on that odd road, Grant walked toward a smaller, narrower road beside the objects that other people appeared to be walking on. As Grant walked down this smaller, skinnier road, he looked around in amazement. What kind of place was this? Had Grant walked into a whole other world? Even the people were dressed in odd ways. And were those women wearing pants? Grant shuddered as he imagined his own mother and sister wearing pants. Then he noticed some of those people were looking strangely at his clothes. A girl passing Grant raised her eyebrows judgingly at him. Grant shrugged. At least he wasn't wearing pants that were cut off at the knees. He kept walking further into the city until they came upon the largest building he'd seen yet. The words above the entrance of this building read, Bits and Pieces Tech Co. Grant had to crane his neck to see the top of the building. There were so many windows. Can I help you with something? Grant looked around to see who was talking to him. A girl about his age with jet black hair pulled into loose braids was looking at him. What surprised Grant the most about her appearance was that she had what looked like two small magnifying glasses over her eyes, the handles wrapping around her ears. No, I'm okay. He smiled, trying to convince himself almost as much as the girl. The girl looked him up and down, nodding. Her expression stayed even as she replied, I was just waiting for my dad while he stepped inside to grab some paperwork. She gestured to the giant building, and I noticed that you looked a little lost. Grant shrugged for the second time since he'd arrived in Scandia. I'm right where I need to be. He shoved his hands in his pockets. The girl stuck her hand out to him for a handshake. I'm Patty Hart, by the way. The people here even had strange names. Grant decided not to react and shook her hand. I'm Grant Bryan. Patty smiled and nodded rather matter-of-factly. She pushed her magnifying glasses up her nose. Nice to meet you. I'm guessing you're not from around here? Grant nodded. I just came here from the neighboring town, Stiffvale. Patty furrowed her brows and leaned her ear closer as if she was trying to hear better. Which town? Stiffvale. Grant leaned back on his heels. Patty gave him a confused look. I've never heard of that town before. Grant frowned. What do you mean? We're less than 10 miles south of here. Patty put her hands on her hips. Are you messing with me? There's nothing down there but endless grasslands. It hasn't been managed for years. Grant shook his head, disbelieving. That can't be. I've lived there my whole life. No one in my town has ever left Stiffvale. Patty sighed. She pulled out a small metal object out of her pocket. Here, let me show you. She put the small object really close to her face and moved her fingers across it. After a moment, she shoved the object at Grant. Grant gasped. There were pictures on the object, and Patty's fingers were making the pictures move. Patty's eyes widened. What's the matter? Pointing at the object, Grant looked back at her in shock. What kind of object is that? And while we're at it, what are those? He pointed to the larger metal objects on the gray road. You mean to tell me you've never seen a phone? Or a car? Patty put her hands on her hips. I don't know what kind of isolated town you're from, but you have some serious catching up to do. Grant shoved his hands deeper inside his pockets. It's not my fault I've never left my town. Patty sighed. I guess not. There was silence for a moment before she spoke again. Are you sure you're not some sort of prankster or something? Do you have some sort of friend filming us or something? Why would you think that? Grant folded his arms. Patty raised her eyebrows. So you're not denying it. She shrugged. It's just strange for you to claim that you've never left your practically non-existent town and didn't know what most modern technology is. You're positive you came from that road? She pointed behind Grant. Grant nodded. That's the road I came from. That's a road that goes through a bunch of land to the next big city, which is Atera. There's virtually nothing between Scandium and Atera. Patty gestured to her phone, which still felt foreign to Grant. She looked at Grant. What year is it? Grant cocked his head, confused, but answered anyway. 1878. Patty gawked. I was right then. Grant scuffed his boot on the solid ground. About what? She gestured to his clothes. You, my friend, are from the past. What? How could Grant be from the past? It was impossible. Patty swept her arms about her. What you see here? This is what your world will look like about 150 years in the future. Grant looked around the street. Wow, sure isn't what I thought it would be. I've always thought that everything would always be the same. Patty nodded, also looking around as if seeing her town for the first time. Things are different around here, that's for sure. Grant nodded, not sure what else to say. Patty began pacing as if she was thinking. Finally, she stopped and faced Grant. Did you have to use any device at all to come here? A form of transportation? Do you have anything that might be in that pail that might be something that's enhanced? Grant frowned. I'm not sure what you're talking about, but no. I walked here on my own 2 feet, and the only thing in this is a half sandwich and an apple. Which brings us to the question, why would someone want to make a whole town think they're living about 150 years behind? Now it makes sense why no one has left your town. Grant nodded. I know. What are we going to do now? Patty sighed, shaking her head. There's nothing I can do at the moment. My dad and I are going to go home and have dinner. Would you like to come with us? Grant shook his head. Thank you for the offer, but I really should be heading on my way home. Okay, Patty said. She was quiet for a moment, then pointed to the road Grant had come from. If I go down that road, how would I get to Stiffvale? You keep going straight until you see a road that turns off to the right. It looks like it goes to a field, but that's the one that leads to Stiffvale. You keep on going down that road until you see the town. Grant smiled. Patty nodded. All right, thanks. I'll probably see if I can get one of my parents and a friend or two to come with me. This needs some investigating. I appreciate it, Grant said. Oh, and one more thing, Grant. Please don't tell anyone about this. She gestured to the road. I don't want to mess anything up if you truly are from the past. I won't. See you later, Patty. Bye. Patty waved as Grant turned around. As Grant headed on his way home, he was glad that he had stuck the journey there and come to Scandia. But there was definitely something suspicious going on here. The end. Thank you so much for listening to the 5th episode of the Sci-Fi Fridays podcast. To find the written version of this episode and to answer this week's question of the day, click the link in the description or go to allieanderson.com/blog and click on the name of today's episode. And today's question of the day is, if you could live in Scandia, a high-tech town who has robots to help them with their chores, or Stiffvale, an old-fashioned town with a close-knit community, which would you live in? You can answer this question and any of my other questions of the day at allieanderson.com/blog. Thank you again for listening. Until next week, this is Allie Anderson signing off.